surrounding me, let it break at your name. Still, call the sea to still, the rage in me to still every wave at your name. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, breathe, call these bones to live, call these lungs to sing once again. I will praise Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, yeah. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, your name is a light that the shadows can't deny. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is alive, forever lifted high. Your name cannot be overcome. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Oh, Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, oh. We trust in your matchless name. We trust in your holy name, my God. Jesus, 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 your name is a light that the shadows cannot deny. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is alive, forever lifted high. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is a light that the shadows can't deny. Your name cannot be overcome. We worship you, God. There's nobody like you in all the earth, Lord. Thank you for who you are. We love you. For those of you singing at home, sing along with us if you know the words. He's coming on the clouds. Kings and kingdoms will bow down. And every chain will break as broken hearts declare his praise. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains. Every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before him. Oh, oh, oh. So open up the gates, make way before the King of Kings. The God who comes to save is here to set the captives free. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains. Every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before him. Oh, every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? 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 Yeah. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord? Yeah. Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains. Every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before him. Thank you, Jesus.
It's a story about how God is the God of the impossible. Again, I just feel like that's right now what at least I need to hear. So if I need to hear it, I'm hoping somebody else needs to hear it. Because that's who our God is. He is the God of the impossible. And right now, that's, at least for me, one of the most important things to remember when you see the news and all the craziness that's going on. No matter what it looks like, no matter how crazy it seems, no matter how out of control things seem to get, our God is still in control, and he is still the God of the impossible. Now, I want to talk about a completely impossible situation today. A situation where God plucks a boy, seemingly from obscurity, and puts him in a situation where he has to completely and totally, fully rely on God. The situation looks so hopeless, in fact, that this boy was the only one willing to deal with it, even though he was probably the entirely least qualified out of everybody around. Sound familiar to last week? You know, God does things like this over and over again just to remind us who he is, that he's with us, and that he is in control. The battle is the Lord's, and he fights for us. That's why he is the God of the impossible, because he's doing it, not us. If these weren't impossible situations that these people were put in, and even us, then we wouldn't need God. We would just be able to do everything ourselves. There's no point in needing God, and we wouldn't even know if God was helping us if the situations weren't impossible. So the story I want to tell begins in 1 Samuel 16, probably know where I'm going already, with a shepherd boy who is about to become a Bible hero, but he just doesn't know it yet. So I'm going to give you a little quick background on this story. I actually had started a series on this quite a few weeks ago, and when this is over, I'm going to continue it. But I want to take one point in this boy's life and relate it to what we're all going through today. Because this situation just feels so similar to what he went through. It just really stuck with me as I was reading it. So there was a king named Saul. Now Saul was having some real issues following God's directions. He was doing things that he wasn't supposed to do, so God starts the process of replacing him. He tells the prophet Samuel to go to Jesse in Bethlehem, and the new king will be one of his sons. The prophet gets to Jesse's house. Jesse lines up his sons. The prophet goes through all 7 of them, and he says, nope, he's not here. So Samuel asks Jesse, he goes, are you sure these are all of your sons? And Jesse says, well, there's a runt, a little guy out in the fields. He doesn't even call him by name, but his name is David. So we have a little runt of a shepherd boy who, by everyone's measure, is nobody. Only useful to watch sheep. His own father doesn't even think enough of him to call him by name. Forget about presenting him as an option as the Lord's chosen one. I mean, are you kidding me? His father doesn't even call him by name, but hey, whatever. Well, guess what happens next? God tells Samuel to anoint him as king. The most unlikely person, the most impossible choice, but that's just how God works. He uses situations like that to show us just how he works, because it's all about him working. So David gets anointed king, but nothing happens right away. And David is going to have to go through some serious stuff in his life before he's ready to become king. We're going to go through one experience that he goes through. Now, David winds up as the personal armor bearer and harp player for King Saul. This is the king that he's supposed to be replacing. That's not confusing at all, but anyway. So even though that whole situation in David's life doesn't necessarily make sense for him in the moment, this puts David in a position to learn all about being the king from somebody who he doesn't want to be like. He learns exactly how not to be king. So this is really going to help him down the road when he does need to be king, because he's already been anointed king. So this brings us to probably one of my favorite impossible situations. I have a lot of them, but this is one of my favorites. A situation that I feel, at least I can relate to right now. A situation that is so big that it looks like there's no way we can handle it on our own. Kind of sounds like what I talked about last week. And, you know, when I look every day at the need that's out there and the people that are online and how much food is in the fellowship hall, I kind of feel like it's a bit of an impossible situation. But, you know, God has been providing. We have not run out of food. We are still feeding people. We have delivered to close to, I think, over 2,000 families, just our own deliveries. The numbers we're probably, I think, at 25,000 people that we fed. I don't even know what that is in meals. We'll have to do all the math. But it's crazy. God has really been moving and working, and we're just kind of in the middle of it, and I'm just privileged to be in the middle of it. You know, God really uses things like this, and even this situation that we're in, to show himself, just so that kind of confound us that, hey, it's not you that's doing it, it's me. Just so that you remember that. Now, in chapter 16, this is what God had to say to Samuel before he chose David. God has to explain what he's doing to Samuel, the prophet, who's the one who's going to pick David. He said, "But the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him." This is about his older brother. "The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People are judged by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So he had to explain that it's not going to be David's older brother, the one who looks like he should be king, but David, the one who does not look at all like he should be king, because the Lord's judging internally. Now, if you ask me, it doesn't seem like someone who you should ever pick to be king, because God even has to explain to Samuel what's going on. That's how completely improbable the choice of David was. Now, God didn't pick him because of what he looked like or because of how tall he was, because all his brothers were much bigger than him. God didn't pick him because of how strong he was or because of how talented he was. God was looking at only one thing. He was looking at David's heart. Now, our God is the God of the impossible, like I was saying last week. He does things and uses people that make absolutely no sense just so that he can show his glory. Just so that we know we are not doing things on our own and that he is with us. That's what impossible situations are all about. They're about us realizing that he is with us, about us realizing that things do not happen through our power, but rather through his power. We are not expected to be able to do everything on our own. In fact, many times that's why he chooses us, because we can't do it on our own, because he wants everybody to know that it's not what we can do, but what he can do. That's kind of the main point of what I'm going to make today. So here comes our impossible situation. The Philistines now mustered their army for battle and camped between Sukkah in Judah and Azketh in Ephes-dammim. Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley in between them. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. So you have two large armies camped directly across from each other on a field that is well known for battle. This is where most of the Israelite battles were fought, because if the enemy were to control that area, it would be very bad for Israel. They could get anywhere they wanted to get. So the stakes are very high, just based on where this battle is being fought. So a soldier named Goliath walks out of the ranks of the Philistines, down the hill into the valley to face the Israelites. He is described as a champion. Now, when used here, the word champion doesn't mean champion as in he won, but it means the word translates as to a man between two. A man between two armies. There were many times the ancient armies decided they didn't want to go to full-out war, but they would let a champion from each army face each other in one-on-one combat. Now, these were two large armies. They were fairly equally matched, and they both knew that no matter who won, the other side would have heavy, heavy losses. So they wanted to avoid that. It was like, I guess, an easy way to get around a real fight. So they would send two people out, and they would fight each other. Now, this would be a fight to the death between the two. That's already scary. But now you have the added responsibility of whoever wins this fight between the two wins the entire battle and determines what happens to the whole army. So that already seems pretty impossible, but as we discovered with Gideon last week, nothing's ever seems to be quite impossible enough because God wants to prove himself. So just listen to the description of Goliath. It'll get a little bit more impossible. He was over 9 feet tall. When I did this a couple of weeks ago, I don't have it with me. I actually had a ladder and I demonstrated. You have to get up all the way on almost the top step of a ladder to be over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet. He wore a coat of mail that weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor and carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. Now, the shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, so it was like this, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor bearer walked in front of him carrying a shield. He had a guy carrying a shield for him. Okay, so let's think about this. If you do the exact math, I looked it up based on cubits and the ancient measuring. He was 9 feet 9 inches tall, almost 10 feet tall. Just, an average door is 7 feet. So a whole yardstick above a door. Just think about that. He had a bronze coat of mail, which was the best armor that you could possibly buy at the time. And it weighed 125 pounds. That's probably the weight of a small, runty shepherd boy whose father didn't want to call him by name. He had bronze leg armor, a bronze javelin, which is like a little spear tucked on his back. He also had a spear in his hands with an iron tip that weighed 15 pounds. Now, 15 pounds is like 2 jugs of water. That's pretty heavy. Imagine what it took to be able to wield that, probably one-handed. So the guy was massive and super strong. We also know he had a sword on his belt. And then to top all that off, he had a guy walking in front of him with a shield. It probably was a full-body shield, so the shield was at least 8.5 feet tall. So a massive shield. So this is literally a walking impossible situation. I can't even imagine the terror that this guy must have brought on. So, you've got a guy walking in front of him with a giant shield. He has armor covering basically every inch of his body. He has a full complement of every weapon you could have ever had in ancient times. He is the definition of a human impossible situation. How is somebody ever supposed to defeat this guy? Now, remember, God has told the Israelites that he is there for them. He fights their battles. But just like us, they forget. Very quickly they forget. So they're scared. But there is one person who's going to remember just those promises that God made. And he's going to remember that our God is the God of the impossible. Next verse says, Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you all coming out to fight?" he said. "I am the Philistine champion, but you are only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then I will be your slaves. Then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. That does not sound like somebody who's trusting in God to me, but we'll get there. So the entire Israel army, including their king, was terrified by Goliath. Now, he's terrifying, I won't deny that. But God has shown himself to them time and time and time again. He's shown himself to the Israelites. He has reminded them that he is the God who fights their battles for them and that he is the God of the impossible. But they don't remember. Just like us, we can't keep it in our heads, myself included. I'm not exempted from this. We remember that God is with us up until Goliath shows up. And then poof, it all goes out of our head. And what do? We panic. We panic because we think we need to handle the situation on our own. But that's exactly why the situation is there, because God wants us to realize that we aren't supposed to handle the situation on our own, that he's going to handle the situation for us. It's not about what we can do, but it's about what he can do. And all of these situations are to remind us of that. So let's see who appears on the scene after Goliath does all this taunting. So now David was the son of a man named Jesse, an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. Jesse, we know this. Jesse was an old man at the time, so it's been a little while. And he had 8 sons. Now all of a sudden he has 8. Jesse's 3 oldest sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shimea, had already joined Saul's army to fight the Philistines. David was the youngest son. David's 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army, but David went back and forth so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. It's been a while since Samuel anointed David. David was told he's going to be king, but he's now serving the king and is still a shepherd on the side. He's doing a little bit of both. Doesn't sound like much happening as far as him becoming king, but that's another story that we'll continue when everybody's back in church. I want to have everybody here before we continue that story. So David's three oldest brothers, including Eliab, who Samuel thought looked like king material, were already with the Israelite army. Goliath has been coming out to taunt the Israelites for 40 days, twice a day, begging someone to fight him. Yet nobody, not King Saul, not David's older brothers, no one in the army had enough faith to step out and face this giant. The situation was just too impossible. There was no way that any one man, no matter how strong, could defeat Goliath by himself. How quickly we forget that our God is the God of the impossible. God was just waiting for someone to remember that it didn't matter what the odds were, because we serve a God who doesn't care about the odds. In fact, just like Gideon, God wants to make sure that the odds are as terrible as possible so that he can come and show himself. The next verse says, "One day Jesse said to David, 'Take these baskets of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers, and give these 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. See how your brothers are getting along and bring back a report on how they're doing.' David's brothers were with Saul and the Israelite army at the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts, as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries." Not sure why they were screaming battle cries, because for 40 days nothing's happened, but they're still doing it. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army, just like every other day. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. As he was talking to them, Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, we know who he is already, came out from the Philistine ranks again. Then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. So David is sent by his dad to make a delivery to his brothers. So it looks like David was not good enough to be sent out to fight with his brothers, because remember, he's the runt. Nobody thinks he's going to amount to anything. So he stayed at home to watch the sheep. And apparently he's now a supply delivery boy taking supplies to his brothers. So David rolls up on the scene, and he's greeted by Goliath, screaming and yelling at everyone. And David's just kind of confused by what's going on. He doesn't get what's happening. So the next verse says, "As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. 'Have you seen this giant?' the men asked. 'He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes.'" That's quite the reward. David asked the soldiers standing nearby, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending the defiance of Israel?" He just wanted to make sure he knew that he heard right. He said, "Who is this pagan Philistine anyway that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" David's already showing that he gets what's really happening here. And these men gave David the same reply. They said, "Yes, that is the reward for killing him." So while everyone around him is terrified, David seems just more confused than anything. He can't quite seem to wrap his head around what's going on, because David knows the God they serve. David knows the promises that God has made. So he just doesn't get it. Here's a pagan Philistine taunting the entire Israelite army. And what do? They run away afraid. So David's thinking, guys, don't we serve the God of the impossible? Why are we running away? What's going on, guys? Wait, the king has offered a reward for fighting Goliath? Why are we offering rewards? Shouldn't the king be fighting him? I mean, the king's supposed to be our champion, isn't he? God is with him just like God is with us. But everybody around David forgot that God was in control. They were trying to handle the situation on their own, but they couldn't. And that was the point of the whole situation. God didn't want them to be afraid. He didn't want Saul offering extravagant rewards to fight Goliath. He just wanted them to remember that he was in control of the situation. But nobody remembered that. Nobody except for one person who may or may not be a small, runty shepherd boy. Then the next verse says, "But when David's older brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, he was angry. He said, 'What are you doing here anyway?' he demanded. What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. I don't know where that comes from. You just want to see the battle. David replies, what have I done now? I was only asking a question. He walked over to some of the others and asked them the same thing. He still he's like, I can't even comprehend what's happening now. I have to keep asking the question over and over again. And he received the same answer. Then David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. So David's brothers get wind that he's been asking around, and they are not happy with him. They think he just wants to get into the battle, because God forbid he get into the battle, because he's nobody. He shouldn't even be around. Because clearly he wasn't good enough to be picked by anybody to be part of the battle. Well, picked by any of the men anyway. God has some very different ideas, as we'll see in a minute. But David's honestly just confused. He can't figure out what's going on. He understands that God works in impossible situations, and he doesn't understand why everybody is so freaked out. He knows that any one of them could go out and fight Goliath, and that God would have their back, because that's what he promised them. If they could only remember all of the promises that God had made to them over the years. You know, when God makes a promise, that promise doesn't go away. If he says he goes before us and he fights our battles for us, that doesn't mean he only fights the easy battles or the battles that we could win on our own. That means he fights all of our battles for us. And just because a battle looks so impossible that we lose our minds, that doesn't mean that God's promises went anywhere. We just filled our heads with how impossible the situation was, to the point where we can't remember what God told us anymore. If we can remember all that he has done for us and all that he will do for us, we can literally do anything. I mean, if we understand that God is the one that fights our battles for us, if we understand that it's all about what he can do and not what we can do on our own, then Goliath is nobody, because God's going to take care of him, not us. So watch how David responds to the Goliath situation. David says, don't worry about this Philistine, David told Saul. I'll go fight him. Don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you could fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he has been a man of war since his youth. Saul doesn't get it, but David does. David understands that he's a nobody and has no chance of beating Goliath. But David doesn't care, because David is more focused on what he can do than what we can do. Because David knows he's not going to be able to beat Goliath. He knows he doesn't stand a chance. But David understands who can beat Goliath, as long as David remembers who's really in control. Next verse says, but David persisted. I have been taking care of my father's sheep and goats, he said. When a lion or bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I have done this to both lions and bears, and I will do it to this pagan Philistine too. For he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. Saul finally consented. All right, go ahead, he said, and may the Lord be with you. So David has been through some scary situations already, and God has used them to remind David who is in control. Even while taking care of the sheep, a seemingly mundane and basically useless job, God was preparing him for what was to come. Now it says David got attacked by a lion and a bear. Now, most people, myself included, would run away if a lion or a bear attacked a sheep. But not David. David would go after them to save the sheep. Even in this seemingly useless task of watching sheep, David was obedient and did it to the absolute best of his ability. And God is rewarding him for that, already has and will continue to reward him for that. David would beat on a lion or a bear to save the sheep. There's literally a lion attacking the sheep, and David comes at it with a stick, basically, and tries to beat it off. And it says if the lion or bear turned on him, he would kill it with his own hands and the club. Now, clearly, God was already with David. And those experiences, while I'm sure scary, terrifying, and confusing in the moment, why am I going through this? We're preparing him for what was to come and helping to remember that God was with him and God was in control. And if he knows that God was with him in those situations, why wouldn't he be with him in this situation? What's the difference? It says, then Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet, and a coat of mail, similar to what Goliath has on. David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like. He probably was kind of walking like this because it was heavy and he's never been in it before. He says, I can't go into these. He protested to Saul, I'm not used to them. So David took everything off. He took the mail off, he took the helmet off, took the sword off. Saul doesn't understand yet what David understands. Saul's thinking in the physical realm that you need to have at least similar armor to Goliath if you're even going to possibly stand a chance of winning this, because apparently he didn't have much faith in David or in God. Now, where David is thinking in the spiritual realm, completely outside of armor and swords, he realizes that doesn't matter. So David remembers who God is, and that it's not the armor who's going to win the battle. It's not David's strength that's going to win the battle, because he doesn't have any. It's not David's military experience that's going to win the battle. It's not his size. It's not his status, because he doesn't have any of those things. He really only has one thing, because David knows that he can do it, so it doesn't matter that we can't do it on our own. David knows he has no chance of beating Goliath on his own, but he understands that God can beat Goliath for him like this in a split second. So it says he picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd bag. Then, armed only with a shepherd's staff and a sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistines. So he's got a staff, which is a big stick. He's got a sling, which is literally a piece of leather about this long with a little pocket at the bottom that you put a stone in, swing it around, and let go. So he's got a piece of leather, a stick, and some stones. So we have a completely impossible situation. We have David, who is a nobody, a nothing. His own father didn't even bring him out to Samuel. He didn't even call him by name. He left him in the fields working. And now he's walking out to face who would have been considered probably one of the strongest and most well-armed soldiers probably in the entire ancient land at that time, or one of, if not the most. And he's walking out to meet him with, like I said, a stick, a piece of leather, and 5 stones. It makes no sense. But that's the point. I mean, it's total madness. Totally and completely impossible. Never, ever, ever going to happen. But that's exactly what God wants. He wants us in a place where he can show himself. If we can do it on our own, what do we need him for? There's no place. If the situation isn't impossible, how can he show himself? David knows that he didn't need the best armor or the best weapons. He only needed one thing, to know what he can do. He knows what God is capable of. And most importantly, he remembers it when it counts. And he keeps his eye on the prize as he walks towards the impossible. That's the only way he would have ever been able to walk across that field to what should have been certain death at the hands of Goliath. He did not. Walking out there with a stick and some stones, he stood no chance on his own of beating Goliath. So Goliath, this is the next verse. Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. Am I a dog, he roared at David, that you would come at me with a stick? What do you want to play fetch, basically, he's saying? And he cursed David by the names of his gods. Come over here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals, Goliath yelled. David replied to the Philistine, you come at me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come at you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. That would scare me if he said that. Today the Lord will conquer you. He doesn't say I will conquer you. And I will kill you and cut off your head. Then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and the animals. It's getting a little violent here. and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. That's what this is all about. And everybody assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. So David understands that he stands no chance. He doesn't even talk about him conquering Goliath. It's all about God conquering Goliath. So David's response truly shows that he gets it. He understands who is in control of this situation. So here we've got a giant cursing at him, and how does David respond? He says, "You come at me with sword, spear, javelin." That's quite a weapons collection. And what does David say he goes at him with? Doesn't even talk about the stick or the rocks or the sling. He says, "I come at you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." Now David knows that his weapons, if you can even call them that, are meaningless against Goliath. Completely, totally useless. David knows that God is the one who fights this battle. David, like I said, doesn't even mention that he's going to defeat the Goliath, but he says that the Lord will fight Goliath and that the Lord will defeat him. He says that the Lord will conquer him so that the world will know that the Lord rescues his people. David truly understands what he can do, so it really doesn't matter what we can do on our own. Next verse says, "As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him, reaching into his shepherd bag, taking out a stone." So David was not hesitant here at all. He was fully committed to this situation. It says that David ran towards Goliath, not away from him like the rest of the army, not around him or to the left or the right. He ran straight at him, straight at the impossible situation, because he knew who was running across that battlefield in front of him. He knew that God himself was running in front of him. He knew what he can do. He knew that God was going to win this battle for him, and all he had to do was trust in that. Now, what if we all understood what he can really do? What if we all remembered that it didn't matter if we can do it on our own? What if we could keep that in our minds when the impossible situations come? Imagine how we could run full force at those impossible situations, knowing that the creator of the universe has our backs. I struggle myself to really grasp that, if I'm going to be honest. We can do anything if we remember that. We just need to remember who's in control of all situations and all of the promises that he has made to us. Now watch what God does with just one person, one little itty-bitty nothingness of a person who remembers that. It says, "Reaching into his shepherd bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in his forehead. The stone sank into his head. Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword." Just like that, the impossible situation becomes possible. Not only possible, but a complete and total victory. God placed the impossible situation in front of the Israelites for a reason. He wanted to show them and the world what he was capable of. The problem was that none of the Israelites remembered all that God has promised them. They were focused on what we can do and not what he can do. When they saw the impossible situation, Goliath, they just blanked. They panicked, eyes wide open, full-on panic. They allowed their minds to be so filled with fear that they forgot who was in control, who had their back, Who said that he would fight the battle for them? Now, it wasn't some guy down the block who promised these things. It wasn't another soldier. It wasn't even their king. It wasn't another country. It wasn't another army. It was the creator of the entire universe who told them that he was with them. The one who can do absolutely anything and nothing is impossible for. The one who can speak things into existence. The one who can heal the sick, give sight to the blind, who can raise people from the dead. The one who conquered death itself by raising from the dead on Sunday. That's who promised to have the Israelites back. That's who promised to have our back. But we forget so easily, just like the Israelites, the impossible situations come and we think it's just too impossible for God. And I'm not exempt from this myself. It happens to all of us. Impossible comes and it's blank. We need to remember that God places us in situations just like David, just like Gideon from last week, just so that he can show his power. The situation has to be impossible for him to show himself. How else will we know that God solved the situation and we didn't solve it on our own? God wants to use all of those situations in our lives to bring us closer to him. He wants us to remember that we are not expected to have all of the answers. We are not expected to be good enough or strong enough or smart enough. We are not expected to have all the right credentials. We are not expected to have all the experience. We are not expected to not even be scared. What we are expected to do is to remember that it's not about what we can do on our own, but it's about what he can do through us. All those promises he made to the Israelites still stand for us. He is still with us. He is still in control. He still fights our battles for us. We just need to make sure that when those impossible situations come, because they will, and they do, we need to remember who is in control and who has all the answers. He will always come through. Maybe not on our timing, maybe not in the way we wanted, but he will always come through. No matter how impossible the situation looks, nothing, absolutely nothing, is impossible for our God. Now I'm going to pray, and after I pray, we're going to close with a dance about how God's not done with us no matter what. No matter how we feel, no matter how we think we feel, no matter what we think we can do, he's never done with us. And as you listen to the song, I want you to remember that it's not about what we can do on our own, but what he can do through us, because he is the one who is in control. Lord, I just thank you for everybody that's listening today, Lord, and everybody who may listen later if they tune in, Lord. And I pray for all of us. I pray that you would be with us in this time and that you would help us to remember that we are not expected to handle this on our own. You don't expect us to have the answers because you have the answers. And you put us in situations just like this situation that we're all in. And you use those situations to help us remember that you are in control and you are the one that has the answers. And you are the one that fights our battles for us, Lord. I pray for any of those that might be sick, Lord. I pray that you would be with them. I pray for a speedy recovery. I pray that we would all remember that no matter what happens, you have given us the ultimate hope through salvation, and that our hope lies not even in this life, but in the next, Lord. I just thank you for who you are. I thank you that you came and that you died for us so that we can have that salvation, Lord. And I thank you for giving us so many stories in the Bible that remind us of who you are and how powerful and how incredible you are, Lord, and how you just want to use us and how you just want to be able to show yourself, and that we should not feel like the burdens of the world are on our own shoulders, because they're not, because we can't do it on our own. And like this situation with David and like this situation with Gideon from last week, the whole point of the situation is that we can't do it on our own, Lord. So help us. please help us remember that when those impossible situations come, that you are in control, and that we need to remember it's about what you can do through us and not about what we can do on our own.